China has pulled off something of a magic trick when it comes to oil independence. Hundreds of millions of people have moved from the countryside to the city, and they are making things. More than just t-shirts, toys, and tables. They're making semiconductors and solar panels, new port facilities, highways, railways, pipelines, fiber optic networks. But follow the oil. Like any explosively growing economy, here's how much crude oil China imported over roughly that same period of time. This is as expected, because when you're building factories, infrastructure, entire cities, you need what oil gives you, which is fuel, plastic, chemicals, even the roads that gas-burning cars are driving on. But here's the magic trick. The last 5 or so years, crude oil imports leveling off, even dropping in some years. How'd they do that? How did they reduce their dependence on the lifeblood of modern industry, the thing America produces more of than any other country?
So for the last 12, 15 years, certainly, China has been on a quiet and increasingly visible push to become the renewable energy superpower of the world.
China is the world's #1 importer of crude oil, about 11 million barrels of oil a day, which is most of the roughly 14, 15 million barrels of oil it uses a day. But over time, China began to acknowledge the possibility, the threat, that if the US decided one day it wanted to harm China, it could choke off its supply. Because while you can move oil by rail and you can move it by pipeline, most oil is delivered by ship in giant tankers. China actually gets 90% of its crude oil this way, and that is a strategic vulnerability.
Where the United States becomes important is that because with the size of its navy, the size of its military bases around the world, the United States is theoretically in a position to strangle China from access to its oil imports.
We can find a really good example of that in the South China Sea. The US routinely deploys aircraft carriers, destroyers, and other warships to the area. It operates nearly a dozen military bases there. And consider this narrow waterway, the Malacca Strait, running between Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. It is the main shipping channel between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. It connects oil exporters in the Middle East to oil importers like China. And it's one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world because taking it can shave 1,000 kilometers off your trip, given the alternative, which is to go through Indonesia's Sunda Strait instead. But let's say tensions over Taiwan boil over, and the US were to decide to block Chinese traffic through that strait, which would block almost all Chinese oil.
Chinese have been talking about this Malacca dilemma since the year of 2001, 2002, right? Because the transportation or the shipment of the crude oil can be easily disrupted by the United States, which has a exceedingly large naval presence in the region.
A big worry for the Chinese government is, can it reliably get those imports into the country without any risk of intervention or interception?
Now, the experts we spoke to mostly agreed that a US naval blockade in this region would be seen as so damaging to China's interests that it would amount to an act of war, which means in most cases, maybe the US would prefer not to go that far. But that just underscores the scale of the potential vulnerability, one that Xi Jinping himself pointed out just a few years ago. As a major manufacturing power, China has to secure its energy supply in its own hands. For him, this is a matter of national security, and one solution to this problem, rethinking the use of oil in the first place. With crude oil, you can make all kinds of things. Plastic, rubber, fertilizer, lubricants, solvents, asphalt is a big one too. But when we're talking about China, the primary use of crude oil is to make fuel.
12,000 cars lined up in a mad rush at Haikou in the Hainan province. These visuals have created headlines the world over for being one of the worst traffic jams ever.
And no country in the world has more cars right now than China. But that's only because China has so many people. And turns out, when you really dig into the numbers, you very quickly realize 450 million cars for 1.4 billion people means that most people do not own a car. Not yet, anyway. So there was the opportunity to upend the auto industry before it even really took hold.
For most countries, EV is seen as the future of driving, but for China, the future has arrived.
Whether you're buying the car or building the car, providing the electricity or assembling the battery, everyone in China is entitled to government money and assistance.
China has invested massively in electric vehicles, but they did it in a really shrewd way.
The priority for China is renewable energy production. There's no point having EVs if the EVs have to be charged off non-renewable sources for which you're having to rely on imports. So the EV strategy has followed, not preempted, the renewable energy investment strategy.
Yes, and I can show you 60 years of Chinese energy consumption in one simple graph to make this point. If you go back to 1965, you can see how China relied almost entirely on coal to generate electricity. Over time, oil came to form a more and more important part of the picture. But look what's happening here with hydro and nuclear and wind and solar. They've cut dramatically into the need for oil and coal. Today, China generates more wind and solar power than anybody. And just to give you a glimpse into what went into achieving that, with wind, for example, the magnets that help convert spin into electricity, those are made using rare earth elements for which China controls roughly 60 to 70% of worldwide production. If you want to talk about refining those raw materials, it's even higher. It's closer to 90% of global capacity. China has gone to great lengths to insulate its supply chain from outside interference.
China thought strongly right at the beginning, let's build the supply chain for the energy, then let's get the renewable energy construction going, and then let's move over to the EV capability. It's been intelligently sequenced.
And the Chinese government has played a very direct role in building that EV capability from the ground up. The Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington figures over the last 15 or so years, China has spent north of $200 billion supporting the electric vehicle industry. And just to give you an example, for the last 10 years, China has exempted qualifying EVs from a 10% sales tax, which can be thousands of dollars per car. But there were also consumer subsidies, manufacturer incentives, priority for R&D funding, preferential lotteries for handing out license plates, all of which helped the industry survive and thrive at lower and lower price points. Look at this car right here. It's called the Seagull by BYD. It's the cheapest EV in their lineup, starting at under $10,000 US. And BYD recently overtook Tesla to become the #1 selling electric automaker in the world. Today, 7 out of every 10 EVs globally are made in China. Look how their industry has transformed in just the last 10 years. In 2015, 331,000 EVs sold in China. By last year, that number ballooned to 12.9 million, representing a larger and larger share of all cars sold. There are an estimated 14 million charging points across China, for crying out loud. You know how many there are in the United States? About 1/60th that number.
So, China's gone on a really interesting journey from infrastructure, critical minerals, domestic renewable energy production, EVs, exports, and the whole thing is a self-reinforcing chain.
As China builds out its EV industry, it has also worked to undermine America's authority in the global oil trade, circumventing it where they can.
Despite a raft of sanctions, Russia has continued shipping and selling its crude oil to the world.
It's estimated more than a fifth of China's oil imports last year was sanctioned oil, as in oil from countries that the US tries to block. From Venezuela, an estimated 268,000 barrels per day. From Russia, 821,000 per day. And from Iran, 1.4 million barrels per day. Oftentimes, the buyers, independent refineries known as Chinese teapots. They're smaller, harder to track, and they operate with less scrutiny.
What a lot of them have been doing is importing cheap oil, refining it, and then selling it elsewhere in Asia. And they have made a lot of money doing that. It's apparently a very lucrative business for them.
And this isn't the only way China's reshaping the global flow of energy bit by bit. Another example, right now, the US holds the world's largest strategic oil reserve. Hundreds of millions of barrels, enough in theory to replace months of oil imports. China is trying to build something similar.
China is one of these countries that when oil prices are low, when crude oil prices are low, they will increase their imports and they'll dump some of that oil just into these giant storage tanks that they're constantly building. So they have massive inventories of crude oil.
A stockpile that would insulate China if the US were to find a way to choke its supply. And China's other long-term play, what Donald Trump might call drill, baby, drill.
In 2019, we saw China's national oil companies roll out their first ever 7-year action plan for increasing exploration and production of oil and natural gas in China. And they started to pump tens of billions of dollars into this endeavor.
And this is an important detail because Chinese oil is notoriously hard to get at. It's deeper, more complex to extract. But consider, the ExxonMobil of China, it's called PetroChina, the country's largest oil and gas company, state-owned. Last year, they spent $38 billion on new infrastructure and new exploration. That's more than ExxonMobil and Chevron combined. They've been digging wells that, in some cases, run deeper than Mount Everest is high. Over the last several years, since around 2018, you can see what this growth in domestic production looks like. This climb represents millions of additional barrels of oil per day. Not enough to cover what China needs on a daily basis, mind you, but certainly enough to reduce what it needs to bring in. And that's really the subtlety of China's position in 2025. To be clear, it needs oil, and it will continue to need oil for a long time. But what was only a few years ago explosive growth in its thirst for world oil has slowed dramatically. Some estimates even figure China's growth and demand will peak in just a couple of years and then actually start dropping thereafter. That would be a big turning point for a country that sees itself as eventually replacing the United States as the world's largest economy.